Welcome you all to CHD 204, Chapter 5, Book and Reading Center. I'm actually going to be using the PowerPoint for this particular informational video. We're just going to hit some hot spots on this particular chapter because we will be in depth with this and within CHD 203, Children's Lit and Language Development. So kind of the Book and Reading Center kind of has its own class where we talk about language development and then how the Book and Reading Center plays into that. So I'm just going to go through, so follow along with me as I move through some of the slides. And so if you're watching the video, what I will be talking about are some of the questions that you will see on the actual Chapter 5 quiz, okay? So here we go. Of course, you can read what the objectives are for this particular course. And one of the things I want to point out to you is the use of books in the early childhood classroom. At least twice a day. The book says read aloud twice a day. In my opinion, you should be reading aloud more than that. Using picture books, books that are engaging for the children. We talk about this a lot in 203 as well, but you know, your book choice and book selection is so important. And if you choose a book that has more text than, let's say, lots of text and really small print, the engagement's just not going to be there. So the use of picture books is an excellent idea when you are setting up your reading or book center. Okay, so when we talk about setup, one of the things we want to think about is that the reading and book center should probably be one of the most attractive centers in your classroom because bringing children and books together is so important. It's kind of setting the stage, if you will, for their future success, because we know in any, whether they are in math, science, social studies, whatever the subject may be, how important reading is. So it's really important that we establish that love of reading very early in children. Another thing about setting up your center would be you want to make sure that you have great seating, but also that you have a core books, okay? And what we mean by that is favorite books on the shelves, books that the children, that have characters that the children can identify with, or that might be their favorite characters. If you've been in a preschool lately, you might see Pete the Cat, Mrs. Wishy-Washy, some of those characters that the children enjoy, and so what that means is they're just going to continue to come back to those books over and over again. So we want to make sure that we fill our book center with books that the children can identify with the characters. Emergent literacy is just that. Emerging means to come into something, okay? So those four items encompass emergent literacy: print awareness, environmental print salient picture books, and emerging into reading. And the cool thing about children and reading is that they were born ready, okay? So children are born ready to emerge into reading. They're just waiting for their teacher, their parent, their caregiver, whomever, to just start exposing that. And when we think about reading, we need to remember too that we're talking about, when we talk about a child learning to read, that process also involves speaking and listening. And that's one of the first things that we remember when we're talking about children and how they are born ready to emerge into reading, is that they've been listening and modeling and mimicking sounds from a very, very, very early age. So they're born ready to learn to read. It's our place to put these things, as teachers, it's our place to put these things into place so that they will be good readers. So reading in the preschool classroom are some things that you see here, but also make sure when you are just reading aloud to children isn't good enough, okay? Just reading with no interaction doesn't really mean much. So if I'm going to present a new book or read a new book to the students, I'm going to make sure that I show them the cover. I'm going to talk about the cover. I'm going to ask them to predict or guess what they think that book's going to be about by looking at the cover. So I want to get them, interested in the book, okay? And I'm going to do that, and involve them in the book by asking them to predict what's going to happen next, okay? So we've looked at the cover. Based on what we see, we're going to predict what we think it's going to be about. And then as we get into the story, we're going to keep reading it. And after, 1 or 2 pages, we're going to say, now, what do you think is going to happen next? Okay. And all we're talking about there is just engaging students. Okay. Just pulling them into the story. Reading at home is so important. It's our job as teachers to ensure that we are sending materials to the children home so that they can read with their parents. So you may have like a lending library, or you may send home books on a weekly basis for them to read with their parent, maybe some suggestions in your newsletter to songs and poems and finger plays, anything like that. So don't forget that when we're talking about reading, we're not just talking about reading a book. We're talking about singing songs, finger plays, all of those kinds of things that involve that emergent literacy. There's lots of books like where we're talking about language development, where play with words. Like if you've ever heard the book Silly Sally. Silly Sally goes to town walking backwards upside down. Okay, that's a play of words. There's a lot of sound going in there. So we want to introduce children to funny words or interesting words, because we know that vocabulary development is so important in the overall reading comprehension. Okay, so the more words they know and understand, the better they're going to be. I'm going to go through this a little bit. We'll talk more in depth in CHD 203 about dual language learners. So I'm going to move on through that, and we'll go into big detail about social development, promoting social development and emotional development 203 as well. We'll actually talk about something called bibliotherapy, and so that plays both into that social and emotional development with children when we're talking about books. All right, so what's your role? Your role is to set up the center, okay? You got to do all these things that you see on the screen in front of you. You got to introduce that book to get their attention by asking them to predict what they think is going to happen, and then engage them while they're reading, so that they are engaged and staying with you in the book. How you read the book makes a huge difference. So if you're reading with expression and your face lights up, and if it's asking a question, where do you want to go to lunch? Where you have that intonation in your voice, it just lures them into the story. Another thing is sometimes I think teachers get bogged down with the fact of, oh my gosh, they want me to read Mrs. Wishy-Washy again. We've read it 10 times. Well, that's what they need while they're in that emergent literacy phase. They need to hear those stories over and over and over again. Because here's the difference. When we're talking about emergent reading and then just conventional reading, where you just pick up a book, okay, and you're being taught to read. The difference is in emergent reading, the children actually teach themselves in emergent reading. And they do that by the way you set up, and you set up the classroom to be a print-rich classroom, and you introduce them to books. So you're a big piece of that teaching themselves that love of reading, that reading process, by all the modeling that you do by your setup and the way you read to children. Now, just reading isn't enough, okay? So once we've read the book, we got to do some kind of follow-up activities, because follow-up activities are just as important as the story itself, okay? Follow-up activities allow us to see what the children learned, what the children can remember, which is comprehension, correct? So we want to engage them in the listening, but then also in the doing after the follow-up. And of course, so you can do it lots of ways. You can do puppets, flannel board, paper dolls, anything that you can let them use with follow-up activities, and then move those possibly over into your centers, okay? So there we go. That is chapter 5. And I hope you enjoyed and learned something.